Now let's go over some principles of sentence structure. We want to adopt a clear, direct style of writing by writing in simple declarative sentences that put parallel ideas in parallel form and avoid noun clusters. Write in simple declarative sentences. By doing so, you will avoid writing hard to understand, tortuous, syntactically difficult, compound sentences that seem to go on forever. A reviewer should be able to read from the first to the last word of a sentence without having to reread anything to understand it. Therefore, when you have the urge to use a comma and keep on writing, stop and ask yourself whether it would be clearer to use a period instead. Breaking things up into smaller bites increases comprehension and is therefore very reviewer-friendly. In one patient who had numerous lesions, the echocardiogram correctly detected a large lesion attached to the right coronary cusp, but failed to detect the 4 to 5 millimeter lesions found at surgery on the remaining 2 cusps, whereas in another patient, the echocardiogram correctly detected lesions on all 3 cusps. So what's wrong here? The long sentence that strings ideas together is difficult to read. Even more difficult is a sentence that talks about 2 ideas at once, or a sentence in which one idea is nested inside another. But here's one way to break it up. In one patient who had numerous lesions, the echocardiogram correctly detected a large lesion attached to the right coronary cusp. It failed to detect the 4 to 5 millimeter lesions found at surgery on the remaining 2 cusps. However, in another patient, the echocardiogram correctly detected lesions on all 3 cusps. In this revision, the purpose is separated from the statement of what was done. The description of the patients is also put in a separate sentence. Now, each sentence talks about one idea, so the ideas are easier to digest. Let's go through another example. To study the mechanisms involved in the beneficial effects of hydralazine on ventricular function in patients who have chronic aortic insufficiency, a radionuclide assessment of ventricular function was performed in 15 patients with pure aortic insufficiency, functional capacity 1 or 2, at rest and during supine exercise. Instead, let's try this. Our aim was to assess the mechanisms involved in the beneficial effects of hydralazine on ventricular function in patients who have chronic aortic insufficiency. For this assessment, we did a radionuclide study of ventricular function in 15 patients at rest and during supine exercise. All patients had pure aortic insufficiency and were in functional capacity at 1 or 2. In this revision, the purpose of the study is separated from the statement of what was done. The description of the patients is put in a separate sentence. Now, each sentence talks about one idea, so the ideas are easier to understand. We try to keep sentences as short as possible. In grants that have especially difficult scientific content, short sentences are particularly important. The harder the science, the simpler the writing should be. English sentences are clearest, most forceful, and easiest to understand if they're simple and direct. Put parallel ideas in parallel form. The value of this is that the form of the first idea prepares the reader for the form of the next idea. As a result, readers can concentrate all of their attention on the ideas, not on the form. For example, cardiac output decreased by 40%, but blood pressure decreased by only 10%. The group of words after but is in the same grammatical structure as the group of words before but. Pulmonary blood flow was always greater than renal blood flow. Here, you're comparing one noun, pulmonary blood flow, to another, renal blood flow. If parallel ideas are not written in parallel form, the logical relation of the ideas gets obscured. Let's go through an example. This lack of response could have been due to damage of a cell surface receptor by the isolation procedure, but it could also be that isolated cells do not respond normally because the cells are isolated. So here, the group of words before and after but are not parallel, so it is not immediately obvious that the second half of the sentence is giving another possible reason for the lack of response. Instead, how about, this lack of response could have been due to damage of a cell surface receptor by the isolation procedure, or simply to the fact of isolation, which could alter normal cell responses. Here, the ideas are easier to understand because the repetition of could have been due to and one repetition of isolated have been omitted. The author's intention of presenting alternative reasons is clear because the ideas are written in parallel form. Another advantage of parallelism is that it allows you to avoid repetition. go through another example. Tracheal ganglion cells have been classified on the basis of their spontaneous discharge, according to their electrical properties, and whether vasoactive intestinal peptide is present or absent. Now, how could we correct this? Here's one way. Tracheal ganglion cells have been classified on the basis of their spontaneous discharge, their electrical properties, and the presence or absence of vasoactive intestinal peptide. Losses of apolipoprotein A1 during other isolation methods were smaller in comparison to ultracentrifugation. How could we fix this? Losses of apolipoprotein A1 during other isolation methods were smaller than during ultracentrifugation. Avoid noun clusters. One noun is commonly used to modify another in English. For example, blood flow, protein metabolism, lung function, ion concentration. But adding another noun or nouns onto an already existing noun pair is confusing. So let's look at these examples. Lower respiratory tract iron burden. Total parenteral nutrition catheters. It's not immediately obvious what these are trying to say. Burden of iron in the lower respiratory tract. Catheters for administering local parenteral nutrition. It doesn't add that much more text to make things maximally clear. The gain in understanding is well worth it. Let's untangle the following noun clusters. Shunt blood clotting occurred after 5 days. Blood clotting in the shunt occurred after 5 days. Blood-brain barrier CSF pH regulation. CSF equals cerebrospinal fluid. Regulation of cerebrospinal fluid pH by the blood-brain barrier. We want to write in simple declarative sentences, putting parallel ideas in parallel form, and avoid noun clusters. And prepositions are your friends. Now it's time for the set of exercises labeled Principles of Sentence Structure. And once you've gone through them, you can check your responses against the answers provided. There are many possible ways of editing these. The answers provided are only one way.